So what was the Buddha's attitude on prayer? That's what we're going to discuss in today's video. Coming up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm Study Director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. And if you're interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll have talks like this out once or twice a week on Mondays and most Thursdays, talking about issues of secular Buddhism, early Buddhism, and related topics. So prayer. Prayer is not something we usually tend to think of when we think of Buddhism, but actually within both varieties of traditional Buddhism as well as lay Buddhism, Buddhism as it's practiced in many, many countries around the world, does include aspects of prayer. In particular, one finds it in varieties of Tibetan Buddhism, and I'll include a video up here somewhere on the screen. I'll include a link to a video where a Tibetan Buddhist monastic talks about that aspect. There's also a recent article in Tricycle Magazine where Ken MacLeod similarly talks about aspects of prayer in Buddhism. And I'll include a link to that below in the notes. First of all, when I talk about prayer, what I mean is supplicatory prayer. That is, prayer from a devotional position, asking some higher power for something that one lacks. In other words, asking for something. So what was the Buddha's attitude to supplicatory prayer? And we can look, there are a couple of very important or interesting suttas in the early tradition, in the Pali Canon, which reflect upon that question. The first one that I'm going to discuss is in the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha discusses 5 good things that we rarely get, which are long life, fame, beauty, happiness, and heavenly rebirth. So those are 5 things that we all want, 5 things that are difficult to get, and 5 things I think that people typically tend to pray for. But interestingly, when the Buddha asks this question, his answer is, when he asks the question whether one should pray for these things, whether it's important to, whether it's useful to, his answer is, if you could get these things by prayer, everyone would have them. He says, if we could get these things by prayer, who wouldn't have them? We would all be beautiful. We would all be powerful. We would all have long lives. We would all be happy. And we would all get heavenly rebirths. In other words, it's not that easy. If it were that easy, if it were as easy as asking for them, then there wouldn't be any problem in getting them. Instead, the Buddha suggests we practice in a way conducive to these ends. So, for example, if we want a long life, well, we should get some exercise every day, we should eat well, we should reduce the stress levels in our lives, we should see the doctor regularly, and so on. But in particular, what he says is that the wise people, that is, the people who really want these things, he says are 2 things. They're heedful and they make merit. That is, they're heedful not to do bad things, not to do unskillful things, not to do unethical things. And they make merit. That is, they practice good in the world. They're kind to other people. They give donations when they're appropriate. The alternative to prayer, in that case, is to do good and to refrain from doing bad, or to act in skillful ways and to refrain from acting in unskillful ways. Is this going to be a guarantee of these ends? Of course not. But at least it'll get us on the road where it'll make those ends more likely. And that's true, of course, whether or not we bracket the question about a heavenly rebirth. The second sutta I'm going to discuss is in the Samyutta Nikaya. It's the ASIBANDHAKAPUTTA Sutta. And ASIBANDHAKAPUTTA was a headman, that is to say, a powerful man, a leader in his community, who asked the same kind of question. That is it possible to get these benefits, in particular getting a heavenly rebirth, by prayer? Or by having people pray for you in his case, because he, as the head man, is presumably going to request his followers to pray on his behalf. And the Buddha says that somebody who is going to hell, that is going to get a bad rebirth, is doing badly, isn't going to do any better by praying himself or by having other people pray for him. And here he gives a simile. He says it's as though you take a large, heavy stone and throw it into a lake. It doesn't matter if people pray, it doesn't matter if you get the entire community to pray, that stone is never going to lift itself out of the water. And similarly, in the case, let's say, that ASIBANDHAKAPUTTA wanted to denigrate some of his rivals, somebody who's doing good isn't going to go to hell by having people pray for him, or against him, shall we say, if you want to, say, lay a curse on somebody. And again, we can bracket the issue of the supernatural elements here and just look at it as an issue of how we should behave. So he says, again, he gives another simile. He says, let's say you take a bunch of oil and put it into a clay jar and toss it into a lake, and the clay jar sinks and then breaks. The oil will normally float to the surface. And what he says is, it doesn't matter if you pray, it doesn't matter if you have the community pray to get that oil to go down, it's not going to sink to the bottom of the lake. And in both of these cases, the Buddha doesn't just mention prayer itself, but doing similar kinds of prayerful things, like dancing around in a circle and so on around the object of the prayer. In other words, these kinds of rites and rituals are not going to be effective on their own. Now, one last thing to mention, if we watch the video earlier that I mentioned earlier with the Tibetan monastic, at the end of that video, she actually does what we would call a METTA practice, or a loving-kindness practice. And METTA practice involves saying to yourself a number of sentences which, in different contexts, would sound like a prayer. And indeed, I'm sure in certain Buddhist contexts, are intended as a kind of a prayer, as a supplication to powerful supernatural beings. But in the context of early Buddhism, in the context indeed of many aspects of even contemporary traditional Buddhism, the metta practice or loving-kindness practice is not intended as a prayer. It's not intended as a supplication to gods or supernatural beings. Instead, it's intended as a kind of a psychological technique to get us to think in the right manner. So, for example, we may tend in our ordinary lives to have negative opinions of other people. We may say to ourselves nasty things about other individuals or about groups of individuals. And that kind of repeated negative mental operation tends to lay down, shall we say, tracks in the mind, or we tend to get more negative over time. We're reinforcing our own tendencies towards negative thought. And with that as background, the point of metta practice is to reverse that process, is to substitute for negative thoughts positive thoughts. So it's to take the specific intention of practicing positive thoughts towards other people. May they be well, may they be happy, may they be safe, may they be healthy, may they gain good things and avoid bad things, and so on. These kinds of thoughts that one is supposed to, as a practice, go over in one's mind is not intended to convince somebody except anybody other than ourselves. It's supposed to be, if we rehearse these in our minds with the intention of generating positive thoughts, that it will in the long run turn our minds towards those thoughts itself. So within early Buddhism, which is the kind of Buddhism that I think is most amenable to a secular practice, at least from my point of view, prayer does not play a part. Prayer is not important, and indeed, as we've seen from a couple of the Buddha's suttas, the Buddha actually thought that prayer was not useful, basically because he saw it as ineffective. It would not do what it was intended to do, and that there are better ways to at least get ourselves on the road to those more beneficial outcomes by practicing in the right way, by being ethical, by being kind to one another, by behaving in wise ways. So I hope that discussion's been useful for you. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for all of your kind comments and questions. If you have any issues or questions about prayer in Buddhism, I'd be interested to hear, or prayer in other traditions. Just put your comments down below. I'm sure that everyone would be interested in reading them, and I would be interested as well. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.